Greetings to everyone. Thank you for joining us at this very important panel on building on Beijing for gender responsive law enforcement and policing. OneRun, the Women's UN Report Network, is pleased to partner with IPES, the International Police Executive Symposium. We have worked together for years trying to raise the awareness of reality issues for the police community in working on women, including women who are in rural areas, women who are in conflict, all over the world. There is a real need to build bridges of understanding and support between the police community and women and girls. And I would like to recognize the IPES partner in this panel is Diana Peterson. Diana is an author and she is a domestic violence advocate for many years. She also wrote a book for Routledge on policing throughout the world. She's ill but not with us today, but still, Diana Peterson needs to be recognized as a strong advocate, continuing advocate for women's rights within policing. And I'd like to read to you a few words of background. The global threats to democracies, justice, and women's security and climate are struggling and staggering. No longer can we live in a reactive world as the storms of multiple calamities have arrived. IPES and OneRun have proposed international scholarly strategies to proactively respond to threats against our planet, including those pertaining to safety, justice, climate, and violence against women and girls. It's hard to believe, as we are here at the UN Commission on the Status of Women in New York, that there are still compounded problems that women and girls faced at the time of the Beijing conference. And after 30 years, we still struggle. I have with me today Dr. John A. Interno, who is a professor and associate dean of criminal justice at Molloy College. He is an NYPD commission captain. He has been on our panels for years telling us the true insights that will help us work better as a gender community with police all over the US and the world. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Lois, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I also want to thank Diana Peterson. She's done a wonderful job with this panel and just been absolutely awesome. I also want to thank you, Lois, for the invitation to speak. I appreciate that, and I appreciate all that you've done for this panel and for domestic violence. I also have one other person to thank, and that's Dr. Dilip Das. Dr. Dilip Das is the president and founder of the International Police Executive Symposium. We have consultative status with the United Nations. So doing this is one of the important aspects of our jobs. And as Lois said, I am a retired NYPD captain. I'm currently a professor at Molloy University in Rockville Centre. I've written 8 books. I'm working on my 9th now, numerous articles, book chapters, and so forth. Today, I'd like to talk about community policing and women's security. And I'm going to talk about some very specific incidents, some quite horrible. But I think that there is hope in the future if we listen to the incidents of the past, and also if we pay attention to the lessons that we've learned from all of our research and other materials that we've worked on over the years. So let's start our presentation. Community policing in democratic society means working with all communities. And what I mean by working with all communities, this includes communities that might include people that are marginalized. So it's not just women, it's not just minorities. I'm talking about all marginalized communities. For example, I'm going to talk later about a case in which the police did not handle right on Long Island in New York in the United States. I'm going to talk about that case, and I'm going to talk about how she is from a marginalized group. Her boyfriend was a gang member who threatened to kill her. And we'll see how the police, in part because of that, didn't treat her with the way she needed to be treated. And ultimately, she loses her life because of the way the police did not handle the job. So police need to be handling all calls for domestic violence quite seriously. And I can recall cases in the past, and now we're going back into the last century, but cases in which the police would say, hey, this is a family matter, therefore I'm not going to get involved. This is the last old-fashioned way of thinking of things for police, and we need to get away from that horrible way of dismissing the pleas of many women who are in the domestic violence situation. So these incidents of domestic violence need to be taken seriously in democracies. Now, and of course, in other places too, but in democratic society, there are particular challenges to policing that I'm going to talk about. And we're going to talk about things like, for example, the police culture. We're going to talk about issues involving balancing basic rights and other issues that are very, very difficult and challenging for us, but they can be overcome. And we'll talk about how we can do that as we go through. So all in democratic society, everyone needs to be listened to, including those people in marginalized communities. And that's absolutely critical for the police to do. Also, they have to defend and protect rights and follow what we call the social contract. The social contract is really sort of an unwritten rule. It's not something we all know about. Well, what it means, essentially, is that officers need to understand the communities that they work in. And this can be very difficult because officers may come from an entirely different culture. And I know as a retired New York City police officer, we learned all about the different cultures that we would be working in. And then when we got to our commands, you become more familiar. And we had people come into the precinct and talk about what was going on in that command. So different commands. It might be LGBTQ plus communities, where we would have community leaders come into the precinct and talk to us so that we would understand their needs. So police need to have that understanding of what's going on locally in the community wherever they work. And that becomes absolutely critical so that they don't misunderstand or misinterpret a cue or a hint that may be given to them, which is critically important. Again, the social contract is generally understood, and the goal ultimately is equal protection. That is, everyone needs to be treated in a fair and equitable way. In the United States, we have the 14th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment guarantees that we protect people regardless of race, class, regardless of disability, regardless of gender identification. People need to be treated in the same professional way by police, regardless of their personal feelings. Police need to put that aside and start thinking professionally. For women, it's been a long struggle for them. And as you can see, I put the Seneca Falls declaration going back to the 1800s, where we start understanding that all men and women are created equal. So we add the and women just to focus in that, everyone, all of us are human beings and need to be respected regardless of our background, regardless of our marginalization in that particular culture. It doesn't matter. We're human beings. And as human beings, we need to have that respect. And that's critical. And police ultimately need to have an understanding of their local communities with the understanding that there are different nuances, different subcultures in all of those places. So becoming familiar with that culture, that subculture, is critically important. We need to hire more women officers. This is critical, and as we'll see later on, um, there are, in New York City, for example, there are about 80% are men, which is fine, but we do need to have women officers, and they have a special role in the society. And that special role is absolutely critical for all officers so that women can add to the work of police. In many cases, for example, when I was working the streets with rape victims, for example, it was very important to get a woman officer there because there was a bond often between the woman officer and the victim. And it's the same thing with domestic violence. There can be a bond between a woman officer and the woman victim, who it often is, not always, but often women are involved in these things. And having those women officers there is very important. Some of the aspects of this is that we've noticed in numerous research studies that physical tests for police department are not done in a fair and equitable way. That is, we need to test the bona fide occupational qualifications, the BFOQs is what we call them, not say upper body strength or something like that. We need to test what's needed to do the job, not just trying to weed out women. And that stereotypical view of what a police officer needs and what a police officer does, that needs to be wiped out. We need to get to an understanding that men and women officers are absolutely necessary to do the job of police officer. And we need to test the bona fide occupational qualifications, not just find something to weed women out of the job. And that's particularly critical with upper body strength. We often put tests in like push-ups or something like that, which is not necessary. So we need to focus on those issues that police need, and that goes for anyone, men and women. We need to focus on those issues, and you don't have to be Superman or Superwoman or that type of person. You just need to be somebody who is willing to help. And of course, you have the requisite bona fide occupational qualifications, which is not really upper body strength. That you do have to have some requisite strength, but not to the point where we're just weeding out women for really no good reason. So ultimately, we need fundamental fairness in the hiring of our women officers. Are women officers, are they treated fairly? And this is a problem. It is a male-dominated occupation, and there is a need for equal employment opportunity. It's important for there to be an office where women officers can go to if there are problems. This is absolutely critical. And I know just from talking to others, there is this glass ceiling that we all need to be aware of. And we need to make sure that women are promoted, particularly when they have equal or even better qualifications than men. And that's the importance of having some EEO officer that female officers and other minorities can go to for assistance to prevent this, or at least minimize the glass ceiling. The police culture, though, is very difficult to change. And this culture is based on the dangerousness of the work environment at times. And because of that, it often is very male dominated. Male officers tend to take pride of using physical strength, but physical strength is not necessarily what's needed at many different types of jobs. Sometimes you just need someone to talk to the victim or talk somebody through things. And that's absolutely critical to understand that those skills are just as important as the abilities to, of course, physically restrain a person. Respect for women officers as equals must take place. And this is often not easy because of this male-dominated culture. And in our research, and I've done research on this, there are two models of policing. We call them the gender model and the job model. The job model is that women just seem to come on and then they just do the same thing as men. But the gender model argues that women bring something special to the job, that they bring something different to the job. And I like to think that each individual brings something different, and we all contribute to a whole. And one of the things we do have to overcome is the treatment of women officers, which can be negative in a male-dominated environment. What I've found in my research is that women tend to bring something special. They do act differently, and there is some assimilation as well, just like men. But there's something that they bring special. For example, I've found with my research with legal criteria, women often will pay attention to that the law, that criteria, and will be very assiduous about following the law, more so than their male counterparts in certain situations. So I talked about the police culture briefly. I just want to hone in on that just a bit because this is well known in the literature of policing. And the danger of the work environment, as I said, this is the key to the police culture. Cops got to stick together. Why? Because they rely on one another for protection when things get rough. And I found even in when I was working, it didn't matter whether a male or police officer or female police officer responded to my calls for help when I was in trouble. I didn't care. I didn't look under the hood to see what kind of, what type of person was responding. I didn't care. I was in trouble. I just wanted someone to come and help. And ultimately, I think most officers are that way. They want someone there. So officers stick together. And this can be good, like in the dangerousness of the environment, having people come to help you. But it also can be a negative thing. For example, if there is corruption or bad behavior by officers, officers tend to keep silent. They don't quote unquote rat out another officer. And that can be a problem, particularly when you have a work environment that may be a negative environment. We've seen this, for example, in the Malin Commission in New York City, where Officer Dowd, who was a very corrupt officer, took advantage of the police culture. He was dealing drugs. He was he was being brutal. He was stealing money and so forth. And nobody would rat him out. Nobody would speak up. And ultimately, he was caught. He was caught by the Suffolk County Police dealing drugs. And ultimately, the whole house of cards that he set up fell apart. And he ended up going to prison I believe he just came out recently. This happened in the 1990s, and he's been released now for some time. But that's the point of the negative side of the police culture. It's something that we have to be well aware of, that police officers sometimes develop those bad habits. Another bad habit that exists, and I'm going to talk to you about this in the next slide. I'm going to start talking about a very important event that took place on Long Island. But one of the things that happens is something we call shit canning. And forgive the colorful language, but that's what police officers call it. And what it is you respond to a scene and you don't want to make an arrest because you're busy the next day or something's going on in your life, and you say, I'm not going to make an arrest. Sometimes the law requires an arrest, and it takes place. And I'm going to give you a quick scenario of something that happened to me when I was a sergeant, a frontline supervisor. I responded to a scene where a woman was stabbed, literally stabbed. She was stabbed in her leg. It wasn't a life-threatening injury, but it was bad enough. It was a felony. By law in the state of New York in the United States, you have to make an arrest. There is no discretion for the police officers. So anyway, I responded as backup. I wasn't even responding as a sergeant, but I get to the scene and the officers were trying to ultimately can the arrest. They were trying to not make an arrest in this case. This is something that's horrible. When you see somebody that's been stabbed and the woman is pleading for help, you can't ignore something like that. Whoever you are, it doesn't matter. If you're a police officer, you see something like that, the law requires you to make an arrest. Anyway, I responded to the scene. I ordered the officers to make the arrest, which of course they did, but I should not have had to respond to that to require the officers to make an arrest. Sergeants can't be everywhere, and officers are often relied on by everybody to do the right thing on their own. They did not. And I'm going to explain in the next slide another case which led to the death of the victim. This is the Joanna Byrd case. It happened on Long Island. It was about 10 years ago. Approximately 14 officers, there are the pictures, this is a Newsday headline, of 12 of the officers of the 14 that responded. All of these officers responded at different times to Joanna Byrd's home with her boyfriend. Her boyfriend was a well-known Bloods gang member. This guy was a tough guy. He was not someone to be played around with. All of these officers, in all the different scenarios, did not arrest the perpetrator. And in the end, there's the final case, final situation that happened. The officers responded, her pleas for help. She asked for help. She wants him arrested. She has orders of protection. There's a whole bunch of things going on with Joanna Byrd and her boyfriend. And ultimately, in that last case, Joanna Byrd was murdered. She lost her life. And in part, all of these officers are to blame. Now, I want you to look at the pictures of these officers. Note that there is not one female officer among them. That's a problem. These officers tried ultimately and didn't do their job. They did ultimately get in trouble, but basically hand slaps on most of them. And what happened here is the death of Joanna Byrd. And this is unconscionable and should never happen in policing. And in this case, the law was violated. The law requires whenever there is a crime that takes place, particularly a felony, but any crime, the officers should be making arrests or an order of protection, which she had. And unfortunately, these officers responded and they didn't do their jobs in the professional way. Now, because of this case, the Nassau County Police Department has changed its procedures and ways of doing things. And that's fine. That's good. We want that. But ultimately, it's very important that these things shouldn't happen and that the officers not, and I truly mean this, not just do what they need to do for the day or what they think they need to not do. And in this case, this Bloods member, this horrible person, ultimately was sent to prison for the rest of his life without parole. So for this case, Joanna Bird's family sued, and they got a multi-million-dollar figure for the failure of these officers to do their jobs properly. These officers did get some minor punishment, but not much. And that's something that's important because the police culture is something that I think, in this case, affected this horrible situation. And ultimately, there was no reason for this woman to die. And this also goes back to what I started with, marginalized communities, marginalized people. Because this man was a Bloods member, I do think that the officers acted differently because they knew who he was. They responded there. These are now 12 officers, and there were 14 ultimately, that responded to the scene. And there are numerous other questions with this case. But just understand, they responded at different times. It's not just they responded once and didn't arrest. They responded numerous times. So they were aware of it. And I think because of Joanna Bird's boyfriend's status as a gang member, I think they treated her differently, and they shouldn't have. And this goes back to we must treat people the same, regardless of the community that they are in, whether it's a prostitute, for example. It doesn't matter. If that person is being beaten or raped, the officers need to take action. And that comes with training, and it comes with a professionalized police department. And ultimately, the Nassau County Department did change training a lot, but it also comes with the police culture. There has to be a culture that supports those people that are in trouble. And that's difficult because in many departments throughout the world, this male-dominated culture is very strong, and it's something that does need to be overcome, and it's something that training and supervision needs to create a situation where police feel that they are doing their jobs in a professional manner. Low morale is also a key issue for police. This is an article on NYPD and low morale. I would point out that the police commissioner just recently has reduced the college and military requirements for the NYPD. The NYPD used to require a 60 credit college requirement, which I think is helpful to maturity, leading toward a mature officer. Or you could have substituted 2 years of military with that. And now, because they're having such a difficult time recruiting, the NYPD at its height was about 37,000 officers. Now it's down to approximately 33,000. So they're down 4,000 officers. But look, they're doing what they're doing. I am not sure that minimizing the qualifications to become an officer is the right approach. I think that ultimately the higher ups need to incentivize people to become officers. we need the best and the brightest to become police officers because it's such a difficult job. We want people who are motivated, people who want to do the right things. And I'm not sure that just minimizing qualifications is the right approach. I would likely do things differently. We want to incentivize people, and I understand uh, low pay, of course, is part of that, but that's not the only thing that's part of it. Part of it is being proud to be a police officer. And in some ways, back when I was working on the streets, many of us, although we knew we were outgunned, although there was crime happening, we felt we were doing good. We felt that we were ultimately helping. And I think that that morale level, bringing that morale up through pride, helping them people to be proud of being part of a professional police force, that will help hire people. So it's not just money. It's about being part of a professional department. And NYPD has great training. I loved my career with them. But I think professionalizing police departments is critically important. Some of the ways that they could save money very quickly. Some states have gotten rid of their police academies. And just like with nursing and with education teachers, they allow the colleges to train uh, uh, teachers, and others in some states have allowed it to be for police officers as well. That might be a way that we could think about somehow bringing up the standards for police, bringing up pride in police, and maybe bringing some level of professionalization to the police department. So we've got to increase the morale. Some other issues with the department, performance management is a key issue. Um, Performance management is where we just look at numbers. We look at numbers and we say, okay, uh, how is the department compared to last year with their numbers? It's known as a scientific management approach. It puts tremendous pressures on officers. And sometimes, in my research, I've documented this. There's yelling and screaming at officers by the upper echelon. This needs to be minimized. Bill Bratton, a very well-known police commissioner, talks about how the NYPD, for example, they brought down crime a lot with some level of performance management, but they need to have what's called a peace dividend, PEACE, a peace dividend. And what that means is that officers and the department itself, once crime is brought down tremendously, they need to treat people on the department well. They need to treat the people instead of yelling and screaming, which often happens at these meetings, these CompStat meetings. What they need to do is to treat them with respect, because what happens at these meetings, and you may not be familiar with CompStat, some of you may not, compare statistics is what it means, but my research indicates that the commanders of precincts who are held accountable, which is a good thing with CompStat, but the negative side is this treating of the commanders with disrespect and focusing almost exclusively on numbers. And this happened for a while, where numbers became the god of policing, where numerous quotas were put on officers and so forth. Officers need discretion. Officers need to be trusted. Commanders of precincts, of course, they need to do their jobs and they need to be held accountable. But ultimately, the treatment, the way that leadership is done, for example, basic leadership skills like punish in private, praise in public, very simple rules that the police department hasn't followed because of this performance management system. There's often embarrassment and so forth. Very quickly, ultimately, the the key to performance management is accurate and timely intelligence. But because of the pressures of performance management, often police won't take complaint reports. And for domestic violence, the law requires them to. And as we'll see when I update you on the figures with domestic violence in New York City, you're going to see how what's going on at NYPD, even in the communities, even with this pressure on them to lower the complaint reports. So performance management is a question. I've documented crime report manipulation. I have 2 books out on it. And numerous peer-reviewed articles. So you should be aware that this performance management puts a lot of pressure on officers and ultimately reduces morale. That's a way that the NYPD could ultimately help morale to improve by treating its officers with the respect and dignity that they deserve. And I think it still is an issue even today, not as bad as we've seen in the past, but it is something that they should address. They should address that, how that low morale is affecting officers. Building community trust is a difficult thing to do. The NYPD has a saying, if you see something, say something. Well, that's a nice saying, but unfortunately, if the community is being berated, summonses have to be written, stop and frisks have to be done. Again, in many marginalized communities, if they see something, they're not going to say something to an officer who has just been writing summonses, making arrests, and doing stop and frisk over and over again. Now, the department has gotten better with this, but I think the saying should be, if you see something, say something, and we'll do something. So it shouldn't just be, if you see something, say something. The police need to do something. And the police need to work with those communities to help people approach police officers. People don't want to approach police officers, and it's a natural feeling where you have somebody in uniform who has a lot of power to arrest, to write summonses, and so forth. The police need to do a better job of building that community trust. And it works 2 ways. The communities, too, need to work with the police. Now I'm going to address some specific issues quickly. The first issue I want to touch on is family violence, and then I want to talk about sex offenses. The number of domestic violence offenders has been skyrocketing. It's almost doubled from 2020 to 2022, and this is a major problem for the police. These are just the offenders, right? We've doubled them. So that's a problem. But as we take a look at this next graph, this table shows that over the years, we see here a huge increase in radio runs. We go from 170,000 up to 194,000. And we see a steady increase in radio runs for police help with domestic violence. And we can see the years, this is going from 2020 to 2024, full year's data. And what we can tell from this is that domestic violence is becoming a problem. And in part, this may be because people are working from home more often. So they tend to be together more often. So that might be the issue. But it also may be that the issue is just not being addressed as much because we're also seeing the number of complaints. We go from 8,000 complaints up to 12,000. Again, you're seeing a steady increase in complaints for domestic violence over the years. And this is with all the pressure on the officers to reduce complaints. Even though they're in that pressure, still we're seeing this large increase. With respect to murders, this is for domestic violence. All of these are domestic violence stats. The murders have basically, they've gone up till last year and now they've gone down a little. That's good. That's a good sign. But they really have kind of remained steady over the years. We're not seeing a real chunk of a decrease with domestic violence murders. So my worry here is that we're seeing this huge increase in complaints and radio runs. And complaints, by the way, for those of you that don't know, they're required by law. When the police respond to domestic violence, the law requires them to write complaint reports and to make those arrests. So my worry is that this wild increase that we're seeing over the years, we need to pay more attention to domestic violence. And those numbers, they couldn't be clearer. I mean, these numbers couldn't be clearer. It's showing a real problem with domestic violence, and the problem is increasing, not decreasing, despite the number of murders. That's just one type of complaint. There's felony assaults, there's rapes, it's a whole bunch of different ones. But I just wanted you to see the worst of the worst is not really decreasing, which is where we want to see those numbers go. So does the law work? And very quickly, the short answer is a little bit, but there are problems, particularly, and studies have shown that especially with perpetrators that don't work, they don't have a job, the must arrest policy is not necessarily the best thing, because what happens is officers make arrests and then the perpetrator comes right back and they're angry and they have nothing to lose. And what'll happen is they come back, and rather than the beatings slowing down, they get worse. And research has shown this over and over again. We often say things like you need to seek shelter and so forth. But remember now, with the large homeless population, immigrant population, and so forth, fewer and fewer shelters are now available. So there is a question as to whether or not the law works. And we do need a lot of research to study this. And people like myself, Lois, and the IPES, the International Police Executive Symposium, we need to start focusing more resources into domestic violence research. And this is absolutely critical. So what's happening? Abuse at home is happening. And economic instability does seem to be a variable that's affecting the situation. Hotels and shelters have lower and lower capacity to handle the influx of domestic violence victims. Children are more likely to be at home. Fewer opportunities to assess the situation. Remember, police have to be called. We do see a large increase, a huge increase in radio runs, and that's good. But there are other places, hospitals and other places, where we need to have that assessment, and we need for law enforcement to get involved, and other domestic violence social workers and so forth to get involved with all of these things. Minority distrust is something that's important. And again, building community trust is important, because these marginalized communities are less likely to call the police when there is trouble. So building that community trust is particularly important. Ultimately, we need a culture shift. The police need to understand the social contract where they work. We need women officers. We need to treat women more fairly. Extensive training for officers, and we shouldn't wait for an event like Joanna Bird to happen. That training needs to be done right up front, and it needs to be done even at the precincts. It needs to be continued. In-service training is critically important for officers. There are domestic violence officers that are experts, and they should be training other officers in the needs of domestic violence. The complaint reports must be taken by law and in New York State, but this is something I think that other jurisdictions and worldwide, we need to think about these changes that we need to take place. We need to assess the laws, the policies, and the police response. So wherever you are in the world, these are real questions. And women in different parts of the world tend to be treated and horribly. If you think about the Taliban, for example, and how women are treated, they can't even go to school. I mean, this is just horror. It's just awful. So that Seneca Falls idea of human rights needs to be understood throughout the world. That's absolutely a critical part. Developing partnerships with the communities, especially healthcare and schools, is also critically important. And with that, I want to thank everyone for listening to my presentation. I know we have others. I know Michael Berlin is here. Dr. Berlin has an excellent presentation. So Lois, thank you. And I'll take questions, I think, after Michael, Dr. Berlin does his presentation.
Thank you so much, John Terno, for your always great presentations of shedding light in areas that the general public is not aware. And we are now at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, session 69. And UN peacekeeping forces have started involving women officers, but there are multiple cases of sexual violence among indigenous or native communities where they serve. But I'm not sure people know that if you are suspected or convicted of some kind of violence against women on a UN peacekeeping force, they don't try you in a court. You are sent back to your home country. And the track record is often they are never prosecuted. Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Michael Berlin. And Dr. Berlin, tell us your experience. I think you can resonate with the whole group watching us today, how important your work through the police community has also been.
Thank you very, very much. Let me see if I can successfully share my screen here after the difficulties getting on. Give me 1 second, and Sarah can help me if need be.
Michael, it's the green on the bottom. It's the green.
I got it.
Yep.
I got it. And can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes, it's in the back end mode. So if you can do presentation mode, that'll come up clearly.
Okay, let me go down and see if I can do.
Do you have a PC? You could just, there you go.
I'm on a PC. Are we
Yep.
good?
You're good.
Wonderful.
Okay. So let me introduce myself and say a little bit about me. I am a former Baltimore police officer. I tell people it's from another life. I patrolled the streets of Baltimore in the 1970s and was in patrol and community affairs. Some people say I then went to the dark side and became a lawyer. I practiced law full-time for about 10 years. But then I got interested really in education. And I went back to grad school, got a doctorate in public policy, and began teaching at the community college in Baltimore City in the 1990s, the mid 90s, where I started teaching at the police academy for Baltimore City. And well over half of my teaching load was teaching law and then some other academic subjects, including community policing. So it was a really interesting experience, having gone from the streets to becoming a lawyer to be back teaching at the police academy. And so I actually had over 10 years teaching at the academy substantially. I got my doctorate, I left the community college, and I now teach at Coppin State University, where a historically Black college in Baltimore City. I've been there 16 years now, going on 17. I absolutely love teaching. We recently did a court security officer training, which was absolutely fascinating. About half the class were female, and one of them remembered me from teaching her at the police academy in the early 2000s. She'd retired from the police department and couldn't believe she was seeing me still teaching. So I love teaching. I'm still involved with some police training issues, and I think of myself as taking a fairly balanced approach to policing. Um, so we have, and I'll get into some details of community policing in a minute and talk about the issues of women in policing and gender in policing, both in and outside of the departments. But first, particularly for an international audience, a little bit of context. The US model of policing is very different from virtually every country in the world. We have approximately 11,800 local police departments, plus another 22,889 sheriff's offices that do full service law enforcement. And I have that star there because in the bigger cities like New York, Baltimore, well, in Maryland, sheriffs have full law enforcement powers. But in a city like Baltimore, they provide courthouse security, they protect the staff. If judges have to be somewhere, they'll be assigned for executive protection. They also serve warrants. And they may be involved in citywide special efforts, but they generally do not do patrol and don't do what we call full service law enforcement, even though they're a very large skilled agency. Most of the international models I'm familiar with have national policing. For example, I did a ride along in Botswana, National Police Department broken down into 76 police posts at the time. Almost inconceivable to me. Others have regions or provinces. I joke that we in Baltimore have trouble supervising 9 police districts from headquarters, let alone having a national model. And you can argue there's different benefits and detriments of a national model, of a local model. In theory and practice, the police do tend to be more responsive to local concerns in a local policing model, but it can lead to corruption, political interference, not that national departments don't have that as well. I take an open systems perspective, and whether or not you're talking about local model, a state model, or a federal model, you really have to think about the legal, political, social, cultural, economic, and technological environments or changes that are going on, because these have a tremendous influence on policing policies and practices. And so right now in the United States, we're in a crisis mode. That women are typically included in what's called DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And these executive orders, the 14151 and the 14173, while they apply to federal agencies, there's also certain applicability to the private sector. And it is not clear what the impact of these is going to be. Last month, a federal court put enforcement of these executive orders on hold with a preliminary injunction. It's not clear if that's being followed, or if it is, how long it's going to last. So the legal future is very unclear. And while local police are largely supported through local funding and state funding, there's also tremendous federal grants and other issues. So we're not clear what the legal and regulatory environment is going to bring. And there have been some real advances for women in policing in recent decades. and I'm really worried about some of them. And as Dr. Eterno indicated, it's far from perfect out there. And I would agree. I'm afraid it could get worse. And we don't know. This is a time for vigilance. It's a time for advocacy. We are really going into uncharted waters. Local police departments. Well, I mentioned earlier there's 11,800 local police departments. This is from the LEMAS, the Law Enforcement Administrative Management Survey. And the last one was done in 2020, and the results were published in November of 2022, and pretty freely available on the web. When or if there'll be a next one, I'm not sure. So as of 2020, there were 14,726 police departments in America that employed a total of 708,000 sworn officers. Those are folks who have the power of arrest, carry firearms. There are significant numbers of civilian employees, male and female as well. Local police departments made up 80% of these. That's the 11,800 departments, and employed 473,000 full-time sworn officers. In addition, the 2,889 full-service county sheriff's offices employed another 173,899 sworn personnel. Now, while Dr. Eterno talked about the NYPD with 35,000 officers, just under half of local police departments had fewer than 10 full-time sworn officers. So when you think about policing in America, the police departments range in size from 1 or 2 to NYPD is the biggest. Baltimore, I believe, is in the top 10 or barely. We have roughly 2,000 sworn officers now, which is down very substantially from my time as an officer, where we had roughly 3,000 officers. And there really is a crisis in hiring police officers in America right now. I'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons, but it's having a dramatic impact on many, many aspects of policing. With regard to female police officers, approximately 14% of full-time sworn officers are female. Approximately 11% of first-line supervisors are female, and roughly 1 in 7 police officers are female. As a general rule, the larger police agencies have higher percentages of female officers. Now, the good news. Between 1997 and 2020, the number of full-time sworn female police officers increased by 51%. Now, that is really pretty impressive. The numbers are still low, but there have been vast increases. When I went through the police academy, women were a relative novelty in policing. I think we had 2 or 3 female officers in my academy class, and then, even fewer as a percentage-wise in the field. So there is some good news here about the increase in numbers. With regard to a brief history of policing, and I think that this is probably the best way of understanding community policing, because and CompStat, we throw around these terms. And so very briefly, political era of policing. This is policing in America from the early 1800s or mid 1800s through the early 1900s. The police were seen as tools of the politicians. Tremendous corruption and inefficiency. The police basically did a combination of enforcement, service, and order maintenance, and I'll talk about that. So the downside was the tremendous corruption. The better part was they were closer to the community because they walked on foot. So they knew people, they were familiar with issues in the community. How fairly they treated people is something entirely different. Reform era of policing. And I was largely a product of the reform era of policing. And in many respects, the reform era is still with us. The reform era of policing, this is the role of the police officer as crime fighting professional. If you're familiar with American TV, this is Dragnet, the detective version, Just the Facts, Ma'am, or Adam 12. And it's interesting, both of these were set in LA. That's not an accident. LAPD was very aware of its image at the time, and they really saw these TV shows as a way of promoting their professional image. So, reform era, tremendous improvements in policing. The police by the 1970s, when I started, there's a far better hiring process, 10 steps in the hiring process, extensive screening, psychological interviews, far better training, and in theory, better supervision, but I'll talk about that later. That was a real problem. But the training that I went through in the mid-1970s in Baltimore was roughly 5 months full-time training, followed by roughly a month of field training. So the police are far better, far more professional, though far from perfect, far better trained, far better equipped than ever before. But what's the problem? Well, two things, or two main things. Crime is exploding in America starting in the 1960s. And what do the police do in response to increasing crime is increasingly aggressive police tactics, stop and frisk, more arrest, etc. And because the police during the reform era tended to end up in vehicles, they lost that contact with the public. And so crime's going up, public satisfaction is going down, and in the inner city, tremendous complaints of racism and police brutality. And these, I fast forwarded because these are from the past decade, and there's some even more recent ones. I would argue that policing is in a crisis today. And community policing was really intended to prevent this crisis, but hasn't. Now, it's more complicated than that because I have an article from about 10, 15 years ago where I talk about the evolution of community policing. And so, with a little bit of basics on community policing is intended to improve police community relationships. And the mechanisms for that are really pretty clear. Dr. Returno talked about some. This is the idea of building trust. This is the idea of different mechanisms for the police and the community to interact more informally. And I'll come back to some of this, but it's really clear how police community relations and community policing can improve relationships. And I've seen it done in my dissertation work. Community policing was also intended to reduce crime and fear of crime and disorder. The mechanisms to do this are not clear. And in fact, this is where CompStat that Dr. Returno referred to came in. we ended up with a pattern of very aggressive enforcement, to the point that it became mindless enforcement, where community policing sees a broad police function of enforcement, service, and order maintenance. The focus in CompStat was crime stats, crime reduction, almost exclusively. And while the police still had service and order maintenance responsibilities and calls, the focus was crime stats and the pressure was crime stats. So, and Dr. Eterno knows this better than I do, but New York City, CompStat in the early days was profoundly successful in reducing homicides. That through a combination of good police tactics and social, cultural, and economic change, homicides were reduced by 75% from the early 90s in New York to roughly 2005. But the bad part of CompStat was mindless stop and frisk, zero tolerance. In my city, it was so bad. Oh, and in New York, I know that we don't have a union in Baltimore. The police don't have a union. They have the Fraternal Order of Police. In New York, there's the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association. The police were protesting against CompStat and the demands for enforcement. And these demands really came from the political sector. In my city, in the late 90s, we had a mayor, Martin O'Malley, who ran for mayor. And his platform was, we're going to do away with this thing called community policing, which I'll talk more about in a minute, which I say we never fully had. And we're going to implement CompStat and this hard-nosed New York approach. I would argue that a decade and a half of CompStat brought this about 10 years later. Complaint after complaint and serious incident after serious incident. All right, back to some basics on community policing. Despite the fact that it's now 40 years later, there is no common definition of community policing. Most of the folks define community policing, the better different definitions talk about different levels, principles and values, proactive programs and activities to engage the public, changes in patrol enforcement strategies, change in management mechanisms, organizational structures, changes in training. And these involve women, as well, women are part of the general population, but they had a particular focus too, both on women inside the department and out. The values, respect, sensitivity, diversity inside and outside the department, partnership, problem solving, quality of life. But under community policing, quality of life, success was abatement. Under CompStat, it became a citation or an arrest. And it was a perversion of the broken windows theory by Kelling and Wilson. It was an article in the Atlantic magazine talking about if you don't control disorder, it's going to lead to more crime. There's not really empirical evidence of it, but I do agree that small stuff matters. But the answer isn't arrest everybody for every offense. Proactive programs and activities, different communications programs to make the public more aware of what the police do. Chief and commissioner advisory councils, district or precinct advisory councils at a more local level, citizen police academies, community crime watches, all sorts of police and youth programs, police in the schools. In my city, the Police Athletic League was a really big program, mentoring programs. Again, Willard Oliver from an old community policing textbook really breaks this down incredibly well. Changes in patrol and enforcement strategies. In particular, a move back toward foot patrol that I mentioned from the political era. Foot patrol really enables officers to talk to people and get to know communities. In intermediate, in some cities where the posts were bigger, bicycle patrols. In Richmond, where I was doing research, the bicycle patrols often responded to serious incidents before the marked cars because some of the posts were so big. The growth of specialized units, we do see it's not just associated with community policing, though. During the 80s, we see tremendous more attention to domestic and family violence, domestic abuse. We see the growth of specialized units in this area. Now, in some cases, like New Haven, some of these units were a direct product of community policing. In other jurisdictions, they were formed either parallel or separately from community policing, but we see the tremendous growth in specialized units. A change in leadership management philosophy, okay? There was real attention to having women join the departments. And this, as a result of efforts to recruit more women, that's where we see this increase of 51% from the late 90s, and it's even larger from the 80s when community policing got its start. Participatory management, treating officers more respectfully, getting input, changing the culture of a department that Dr. Eterno talked about. Decentralizing power down to in our city, the district commanders are majors. In New York, they're precinct captains, Richmond precinct captains, but giving more power at levels closer to the community. Now, the catch was in CompStat, it came with tremendous accountability, particularly for crime control. But in community policing, it was more, the police were obviously doing crime control, but there was more of a focus on community. Changes in training, communications training, diversity, sensitivity, problem solving. Now, this doesn't mean that basic police training went away. You still had to do your law, you still had to do your patrol tactics, report writing, but it was these additions. And my own take is police training is actually far better than most people realize. That the typical big city academies, municipal academies, it's at least 5 or 6 months of full-time training, followed by more extensive field training. My experience has been that the real difficulties have been with supervision in the field. And so you have the Chauvins, the Derek Chauvins from the George Floyd, who have complaint after complaint and nothing is done about it. And if you look at those incidents I cited earlier, many of those officers had previous complaints that nothing was done about them, or little was done about them. All right. Police departments with specialized community policing, domestic violence, crime analysis units. Roughly, as of 2020, roughly 91% had specialized community policing units. Roughly 95% had crime analysis units that are a key to CompStat. Just under 95% sexual assault units, 92% child abuse endangerment units. Domestic violence was 89.3% in 2020. The previous survey was 2016. These numbers vary a little bit. The community policing was actually a tiny bit down from 2016. But we see, but it's not just specialized units. It's how patrol addresses these issues. I've talked about CompStat. John, Dr. Eterno went over these elements. And I think that this is a really critical juncture as we think about the challenges and issues facing American policing today. both involving women inside and outside the department and beyond. I have never seen a society more polarized than the one that we have today. And we are really challenged to be responsive to the community, to treat people inside and outside the department fairly, but the police also have to be effective at crime control. That there are these two very strong public demands, and we need really visionary leadership to combine these two and address these problems in a humane way. And it is a real challenge. And I think that's a sort of a fair statement of where we are today. With regard to domestic violence, Baltimore, like New York, has a very strong pro-arrest policy. Generally, very good and very healthy. I mean, we really need that. Now, I do have some other material, but I don't want to touch on it too much. I have some supplemental materials that I'll just sort of briefly gloss over because there may be some interest, but and tie it to the earlier part of the presentation. First, the UN definition of domestic abuse is actually far broader than the legal definitions in America, particularly when defining it as a crime. Most domestic violence, assault and battery, are the functions of state law, not federal law. The vast majority of criminal law is made at the state level and tried in state courts. And this is where we're going to see the vast majority of domestic violence crimes. There is some limited federal law involving domestic violence. The good news is that the Violence Against Women Act, which expired in 2019, was reauthorized in 2022 after a major battle, excluding trans people and the provisions that forbid those convicted of domestic violence are not allowed to legally possess firearms. And that was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court recently.
Michael, we have about
Yes.
10 minutes left.
All right,
So
I'll finish up in less than a minute. Perfect. I thought I was behind.
no, you're good. You're good.
And then the other domestic violence are interstate transportation and domestic violence. So again, mostly state law. There are duties of a police officer in responding to a domestic violence call in terms of protecting a victim, letting him or her, more often her, to retrieve their belongings safely. There are protective orders at the state level I won't go into. And I think that I have just done justice. Let me stop sharing my screen here. And I just want to say thank you. I am open to questions. And I love Dr. Returno's presentation. We've known each other a long time. And it's great to see Lois Herman again. It's been a while, but thank you for this opportunity and to be with everybody. And thank you, Sarah, for everything you did to get me on Zoom successfully.
Yes, happy to do it.
Okay, Lois, did you have any?
Thank you so much, Dr. Turtle and Dr. Berlin, because your presentations were truly unique. I'm not sure that the women in our, what we call the women's movement, see this kind of information on a regular basis. It would be very valuable. I want to make just a few quick comments. One is rural women. We know that there is the issue of shame, discrimination, and for a rural woman to report a family member or a neighbor her husband may be a good friend of the mayor or someone in local politics. And so that may escalate the violence. We had a program once that supplied women in rural areas with cell phones. And that made some difference, but it just didn't survive. And same way of asking women who were entered into a hospital emergency room, are you experiencing violence? And maybe her perpetrator is sitting out in the waiting room. Two other issues that have escalated violence against women and girls, well, besides COVID, are drugs and narcotics. And another is online violence. And One Man has done a number of programs, including at the European Union, on online violence. We cannot always assume that it's just young women who are the victims, because with the changing demographics in the United States and all over the world, older women are also at risk of violence. And maybe it's gone on a long time, and maybe it's just starting, but it's a reality. And we as women are often victimized in many different situations. Sarah, we have a few questions. Maybe we can bring them up.
Yes, we have a few questions here. Let me just go back up to the top. I'm just going to make a comment here. Frank submits, this is horrific. As a survivor, I speak from experience on how I was received on reporting when I say that some male officers need to be educated on DV and DA. The next question that came in talks about how can policing begin to build a culture of gender responsive practices, and can you share some examples? So this is like a how-to. So I'll open it up to the panel.
Well, first I'd say it's not easy. And I talked about the police culture, how it's a male-dominated culture. Training is part of this. And the problem, as I see with training, and Michael, Dr. Berlin and I may have a little bit of a difference here, because I do think training's good, but unfortunately, I think because it's at the police academies still, that the police culture is inculcated immediately into the officers as soon as they get into a police academy setting through war stories and other types of things like that. So I do think college education is important, and I do think it's important to be exposed to all different cultures even before you become a police officer. Some of the success stories I think that we could talk about in terms of this. I know that Pennsylvania, for example, has just started a program where new officers are brought in and they have to receive a card that they've been trained at colleges, so that at the colleges they're exposed to all different types of people, not just people that want to be cops. So I think that that's a model that has hope for the future. So I would argue that that's a good way to go. I do think that you're going to have some police academy, but I do think we can minimize it, and we can save a lot of money by minimizing the training at the department and switch them over to colleges, just as nursing and education is done.
Let me chime in. Let me chime in on that for a second. And I would think, for me, leadership in the department is absolutely critical. Leadership at the police academy, leadership at the college, if it's on a college setting, that leadership is critical. And that if the leaders set the tone, and if leadership takes respect, sensitivity seriously, you're going to see more of that in officers. Now, I believe in a sort of proactive management strategy where you get officers to try to buy into the vision of policing in a positive, community-oriented way. But if they don't, then accountability. There has to be accountability for poor action or bad action. So I think leadership plays a role. My experience as an educator in the police academy, I actually, when I taught at the Baltimore Police Academy in the 90s and early 2000s, tremendous academic freedom, ability to share. The classes were roughly 25% women, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. And that the student attitudes were generally pretty positive. Um, I worry about lowering standards now because of the crisis in hiring. I really do worry. Um, I do think colleges can do a good job with the academic portion of police training. Um, I think there has to be a balance. I was involved in the
Michael, you got
police.
about, like
All right,
30 seconds
all
here.
right. The my I was involved in the police training by college educators, the police corps. And we showed that you could do top-notch tactical training and top-notch academic training. But it was really hard building a service orientation and that sensitivity. And somehow we have to be realistic about the danger part of policing and sort of come to a model that works. And I think that would help with the culture. I know that other questions haven't been answered. I will put my email in the chat. I just want to thank all of the participants. I'll put my email in the chat. I'm away at the Academy of Criminal Justice Science Conference in Denver, and I'll get home next week and I'll have a chance to really respond to emails. So I'll put my email in the chat. I just want to thank everybody and great questions and comments in the chat.
Thank you, everyone. We're out of time right now. I just want to thank everyone for attending. Thank you, Lois. Thank you, Dr. Berlin. Thank you to Sarah. Thank you to everyone. I want to thank Dr. Dilip Das and Dr. Peterson, Diana Peterson, and many others. Thank you so much for your attendance. And my email address is jeterno, JETERNO @Molloy, MOLLOY.edu. Happy to answer questions.
And my email is, I just put it in the chat, mberlin@coppin.edu, MBERLIN@COPPIN.edu. I want to echo Dr. Returno's thanks. It was a real pleasure to get to participate in this. Again, just thank you.
Thank you. Thank all of you. Sarah, do we have a couple more minutes?
There is a couple more minutes. If we wanted to answer, maybe we could maybe do one more question.
Well, I wanted to just make one statement. We
Okay.
found in Minneapolis, the home of the late George Floyd, that if police drove their car home and parked it outside their house, that there was a reduction in crime. Any comments on that?
Sure. I'd be happy to talk about that. Yeah, I mean, there are some places where they do allow bringing the car home, but that's also exposing the officer and his or her family to some level of openness to the community. So that could be good. It might be good, especially in rural areas. I think it might be helpful. I'm not sure in a city atmosphere that officers would do that. I have taken the car home a couple of times in my roles, and I haven't had any issues. But I have had people that I've arrested in the past come up to me with my family, which is kind of uncomfortable when they are
Okay,
there.
thank you for that. Another thing is that we found that when men get out of prison, that may be a very risky time for their previous victim.
Yeah, that's true, and most research does show that, by the way, particularly those who are unemployed. So if they don't have a job, they are more willing to take risks because they have less to lose.
Sarah?
And most states should have some obligation to notify victims about an offender being released from prison. I suspect there'll be tremendous variations in state laws and regulations on that, but certainly the very least that the victim should get is notice of some kind.
Yes, and we also know by research that women in prison are often the result of being a victim of domestic violence.
You
Any
mean
more for it?
arrested for something arising out of a domestic violence incident?
Yes, exactly. That's on not only the state level, but on the federal level
At
too.
federal level.
And Sarah, any more?
I think we probably are at about time. And so I was able to, Dr. John, get your email in the chat as well. So
Thank
our
you.
attendees can copy that and submit their questions if they need further explanation. But everybody said it was amazing. Thank you. Great information. Thank you to all. So wonderful webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. We'll
My
do this
pleasure.
Thank you
again.
very much.